Most of the music that we're familiar with is highly structured, follows a discernible pattern, often involving recurring elements. For example, it's common for songs to be divided into verses, all of which have the same melody. Here's an example that you probably know. Deck the halls with boughs of holly, fa la 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 la. 'Tis the season to be jolly, fa la 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 la. Don we now our gay apparel, fa la 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 la. To the ancient Yuletide carol, fa la 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 la. See the blazing Yule before us, fa la 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 la. Strike the harp and join the chorus, fa la 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 la. Follow me in merry measure, fa la 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 la. While I tell of Yuletide's treasure, fa la 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 la. Now that's just the first two verses, but the others are exactly like it, melodically and harmonically. We can see things like this happening on an even smaller scale. So consider the song, Mary Had a Little Lamb. Mary had a little lamb, little lamb, little lamb. Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow. Start with the first half of the song and the 7 notes right at the beginning, sung to the words, Mary had a little lamb. Mary had a little lamb. Let's call these 7 notes the A section. Notice that the A section repeats a little later. But after each time through the A section, you get something different. Let's call the bit sung to the words little lamb, the B section. Little lamb. And what follows the second time through the A section is different both from the A section and the B section, so we'll call it the C section. So the form of the entire tune is A, B, A, C. This whole scheme then repeats for the second half of the song. Everywhere that Mary went, Mary went, Mary went. Everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. Something else you might have noticed about the B section is that although it's different from the A section, it reproduces the rhythm of the last part of the A section. So every time you sing Little Lamb, you have the same rhythm, though nothing comparable happens in the C section. But the song in its entirety can be seen to be made up of recurring elements. And let me do it all the way through now, showing you the different sections. A section, Mary had a little lamb. B section, little lamb, little lamb. A section, Mary had a little lamb. C section, its fleece was white as snow. I want now to take another familiar kiddie song that follows a different scheme, one of the most common in all the music of the Western tradition, namely, Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are, up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Now notice what happens here. First you have the part sung to Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, How I Wonder What You Are. As we did before, let's call that the A section of the song. Then you get something different to the words up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. That's our B section. Then, just as in Mary Had a Little Lamb, you get the A section again, now with exactly the same words as before. And that's it. You have A, B, A. This structure, also called ternary form, shows up again and again in our music. For example, in a symphony, which ordinarily consists of 4 individual movements, the third of the 4 is very commonly in ABA form. Here's another example, the 5th movement of Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition, called Ballet of the Chicks in Their Shells. It was inspired by a design for a ballet costume to be worn by children portraying chicks in the process of hatching, and is full of pecking, cheeping sounds, along with a little portion that suggests the fluttering of wings. Now here's a breakdown. Here's the A section. That then repeats, after which we get the B section. And then the A section comes back without repeating, followed by a little concluding tag called a coda. A close relative of this scheme is the one that you find very commonly in popular songs. So commonly, in fact, that it's often called the pop standard form. Here the arrangement is A-A-B-A, as you can clearly hear in the song Yesterday. Yesterday, all my troubles seem so far away. Now it looks as though they're here to stay. Oh, I believe in yesterday. Suddenly, I'm not half the man I used to be. There's a shadow hanging over me. Oh, yesterday came suddenly. Why she had to go, I don't know. She wouldn't say. I said something wrong. Now I long for yesterday. Yesterday, love was such an easy game to play. Now I need a place to hide away. Oh, I believe in yesterday. Now, the first two A sections are these. Yesterday, all my troubles seem so far away. Now it looks as though they're here to stay. Oh, I believe in yesterday. That's the first one. The second one is, suddenly, I'm not half the man I used to be. There's a shadow hanging over me. Oh, yesterday came suddenly. They're commonly called verses. And the B section, which provides contrast, is called the bridge. Why she had to go, I don't know, she wouldn't say. I said something wrong, now I long for yesterday. And now comes the last A section, yesterday. Love was such an easy game to play. Now I need a place to hide away. Oh, I believe in yesterday. And then a coda. Something you might have noticed is that because the A section of Ballet and the Chicks in Their Shells is repeated before the B section, but not after the B section, it actually has the AABA form too. I point this out because it's widely assumed in our culture that popular and classical music have nothing in common, belonging to completely different worlds. This is absolutely not true. Popular and classical music are just different offshoots of a single musical tradition whose most basic elements are exactly the same. Now, I want to point out that each individual verse of Deck the Halls also has this ABA form, or a slight variant of it. Here's the first A portion. Deck the halls with boughs of holly, fa la 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 la. And here's the second. 'Tis the season to be jolly, fa la 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 la. Now we get the B section. Don we now our gay apparel, fa la 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 la. And then the A section returns slightly altered in the fa la 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 la's. To the ancient Yuletide carol, fa la 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 la. But there's an even simpler structure that you often find in music of the 17th and 18th centuries, and also in some later music. A-B, or binary form. That is, you have just two sections. The first section usually repeats, and the second section may repeat also. Here's an example by Bach, a movement from one of the suites for keyboard that have come to be called the French suites. It's a kind of dance called a gavotte. And what happens is that it starts in one key and then goes through a series of other keys before coming to rest at the end of the A section. Then in the B section, it makes its way back to the original key. Although each section is supposed to be played twice, I'll play each one just once and put a big pause in between. Now, the binary and ternary structures are sometimes combined, and this can happen in a number of different ways. One of the most common of these gives you something that's come to be called sonata form, which developed in the 18th century and which continues to be widely used in later music as well. Sonata form is a kind of binary form in that you have two main sections, each often repeated. The A section, called the exposition, has a change of key, which usually comes about halfway through and eventually comes to rest on a key other than the one it started in. Here, for example, is the A section of the finale of Mozart's Fourth Piano Sonata. Now let me play it again and point out where the key change happens in case you missed it. Right here. See, we were in this key, and now suddenly we're in this one. We're starting, but now the B section is divided into two portions. The first, called the development section, or sometimes just the development, brings you back to the original key, often making use of thematic material from the exposition. In our example from Mozart, it goes like this. And now we're back in the original key. Then comes the second portion of the B section, called the recapitulation, in which music from the exposition is brought back, but without the key change heard in the exposition. In this case, the music all stays in the original key, the one in which the piece started out. In some others, there may be key changes here too, but not to the key of the later parts of the exposition. Here now is the whole thing from start to finish. I should say that the term sonata form is kind of misleading. Not all sonatas take this form, and lots of things do take it that aren't sonatas. The common practice among classical composers, although it isn't a requirement, is for the first movement of a multi-movement composition to be in sonata form, whether or not it's the beginning of a sonata. It could be the start of a symphony or a string quartet or a concerto, for example. Now, before we go any farther, I want to ask a question. What's the point of following a form? Well, there are several answers. One of them is that if you're a composer starting out on a brand new piece, having a plan in mind will often help you structure the task. You're not starting completely from zero. You already have at least some idea of what you're going to have to do. You may not know exactly how you're going to fill in the blanks, but at least you know what blanks you're going to have to fill. The particular forms that we've been talking about also help with another problem. When you compose music, you're confronted by two conflicting demands, one of which is unity. You want your music to hang together as a coherent whole, which means that it's a good idea to have certain ideas that come up repeatedly as a way of relating things that happen later to things that have happened earlier. That's what's going on in a very simple way in a song like Deck the Halls. The second verse repeats the melody of the first, the third repeats the melody of the second, and so on. And as we saw earlier, there's also repetition within each verse. On the other hand, you also want contrast. You don't want to bore the listener by just doing the same thing again and again, especially in music that doesn't have words. One way to reconcile these two demands is to set things up in such a way that certain ideas, once introduced, come back later, but with different ideas being introduced along the way. And part of the reason for the popularity of sonata form as a vehicle for composition is that it does a particularly good job of resolving the tension between the two different needs. You introduce certain ideas in your exposition, then you play around with some of them in your development, and then in the recapitulation you represent them, though not exactly as they were originally presented. But there's another feature of sonata form which is probably just as important, if not more so. Namely, that it gives the music a compelling three-act dramatic structure. Here's what I mean. A story, or drama, often has four main elements: an initial situation, some kind of complication, a struggle to overcome the complication, and a resolution which restores the status quo. In the first act, we're given the initial situation and the complication. The second act presents the struggle, and in the third act comes the resolution. In each of the three main portions of the sonata form, exposition, development, recapitulation corresponds to one of the acts of the drama so conceived. Let me show you how this plays out, so to speak, in our Mozart example. Our initial situation is presented in the starting key. But now suddenly the key changes, taking us away from our familiar, comfortable home territory. And so on. And with that, we get a complication, something that has to be resolved. In this case, we have to find our way back home, as it were. And that's what the development section does after a number of false starts and blind alleys. And now, finally, we've made it back home to the original key, and we stay there, bringing everything to a nice, neat conclusion. want to talk about another form that you'll find quite a bit in music from the 17th and 18th centuries, but also in later music. The rondo, as it's called in French, or in Italian, and also in English, rondo. What happens here is that you start with a theme and you maintain unity by bringing it back periodically. But you separate the occurrences of the theme with contrasting sections called episodes. The theme may also be recalled in the episodes, but it doesn't have to be. I'm going to play you two examples, one from the early 18th century and one from later in the same century. The early one is by the French composer François Couperin. It's called Les Barricades Mystérieuses, which nobody really understands. Literally, it translates as mysterious barricades, but no one has ever figured out exactly what Couperin meant by that. No matter, it's a beautiful piece, and here it is. So let's take it apart. Here's the theme. And here's the first episode. Now, as I'm sure you've noticed, the episode, while different, retains some of the character of the theme, most particularly in the rhythm and the figuration. Then we come back to the theme. And here's the second episode. And here's the theme again. Third episode. last time through the theme. Here now is another example, this one by Mozart, the finale to another one of his piano sonatas. It's much more elaborate than the one by Couperin, and with some distinctive properties that I'll talk about after I've played it for you. Now you might have noticed that in this piece there are also elements of sonata form, making this an example of what's sometimes called a sonata-rondo. Here's how it works. The theme and the first episode together work like a sonata exposition. Here's the theme, heard twice in somewhat different guises. Next, we get a little transition, in the course of which you'll hear a change of key. And once we're in the new key, a new theme comes in. Then there's another transition returning us to the original key, after which the theme comes back for the second time. But before we go on, let's remember that the theme and first episode act as a sonata exposition. Now, as you might expect, the second episode works something like a development section, playing around with thematic material introduced earlier, starting with the theme again. Now we get that transition again. And here's the second episode. So to repeat, the second episode in a sonata-rondo serves as a development section. Now we get the theme and the third episode, which, not surprisingly, act as a recapitulation. Here again is the theme. Transition. Now in the third episode. And notice that there's been no key change. But Mozart isn't content to leave things at that, and he adds a twist. Once the main business is over, he adds a section called a cadenza, a place in which the player gets a chance to show off a little bit, and which in some ways acts like a second development section. And then finally we get a last statement of the theme, followed by a coda. You may remember that term from a little earlier, meaning a bit tacked on at the end, tying everything up with a nice little bow. Now I want to take a little time to talk some more about unity versus contrast. Another way in which you can satisfy these two requirements is by bringing back material you've presented before, but in a modified form. There are a number of ways you can do this, but the most obvious is the one that you find in the kind of composition called theme and variations. You present a theme, then you represent it several times, each time in a different form, a variation on the theme. As an example, and to wrap up this video, I'm going to play you one of my favorite examples of theme and variations, again by Mozart. It presents a dozen variations on a theme that Mozart knew as the melody to a French children's song called Ah, vous dirai-je maman, but that we in the English-speaking world also know and that you'll have no trouble recognizing. In fact, you've already heard it in this video. So there you have it, theme and variations. And remember, this is another way of balancing unity and contrast by use of a principle that I like to call same but different. The theme and the variations are all alike in some respects, and yet the variations are also all different from the theme and from each other. So now you know something about musical form, about the AB-ABA and AABA structures, about sonata form, and also about the rondo and theme and variations. You've learned about how these various forms enable you to balance unity and contrast. And you've also learned about the same but different principle in music. I hope that you found this helpful and informative. Thanks for watching.